Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we are going to be looking into Shroud Runners again. So Shroud Runners are a unit that we haven't really talked about in a while. I've talked about them here and there when they come up in competitive lists, as well as videos covering my own lists or other units that might have synergy with the Shroud Runners. Now, Shroud Runners are a unit that has come into prominence quite recently because of the last balanced data slate, which nerfed a lot of the highest tier competitive play Eldar units, including things like Wraithguard, of course the Yinkarn, and the Night Spinner most importantly. And a lot of players have had to go back to the drawing board, and what do you know, Shroud Runners have started appearing in many a list. And as someone who really likes Shroud Runners and has advocated for them since the beginning of the edition, I'm really happy to do this video, and I'm really happy to start to see more players recognize their true greatness. So having said that, let us go ahead and dive right into it. So we're going to be first looking at the stats, weapons, and special rules of the Shroud Runners, kind of give you guys a quick review of what they do. Their strengths and weaknesses, we're going to look at their combos and synergies. We're going to be talking about making the most out of your scout move, which I believe is one of the key ways to using the Shroud Runners to the best of their ability, and the role Shroud Runners play in an Eldar army and how to make the most out of them. So starting off with the profile of the Shroud Runners, they are very fast at movement 14, being jet bikes, and they are a bit tougher than your average jet bike with 3 wounds versus 2 wounds. And they do have toughness 4 like all other jet bikes, and also come with a 5+ invulnerable save against shooting. So just like Rangers do, they have a 5+ invul against shooting, and this actually makes them fairly durable against high strength, high AP attacks. As far as their ranged weapons go, they are armed with Ranger long rifles, which have precision, which are good at, taking a couple wounds off of characters here and there. They have scatter lasers as well, which have good volume of fire, and they're good against weaker units like guard equivalent enemies, things like cultists, Imperial Guardsmen, and so forth. And they also have those shuriken pistols for secondary objective scoring, which means they could advance, still be eligible to shoot, which means they can score on several secondary objectives. As far as their melee weapons, they're probably the worst melee unit in the entire index, unfortunately. They only have 1 attack at strength 3, AP 0, and unlike regular rangers, they come in a unit of 3. So you're basically getting almost no attacks back at your opponent. But they really don't want to be in combat anyway, unless you are using them in a specific way to block opponents from moving forward. So they're really not there to deal damage in melee combat whatsoever. As far as their abilities go, this is where they truly start to shine. They have the Scout 9 move, which makes them really useful for a number of sneaky and disruptive plays, which I'll talk about in a second. They also have Stealth, making them more durable. So, that -1 to hit is really good on Shroud Runners specifically, and it's even more powerful than on Rangers, because of course Rangers are still very vulnerable to massive amounts of firepower, like bolter fire and things like that. Typically stuff that doesn't really care much about the stealth, but because these are 3 wound models, they have that 5+ invul, opponents are going to have to use heavier weapons typically to deal with them, things like plasma guns and stuff like that. So having that -1 to hit actually does come into play more often than you would think. They also have target acquisition. Now, they would be good if they just had the other stuff, but target acquisition makes them very well-rounded in pretty much any list because they can mark a target within 12 and give your other units lethal hits against it. So there's a lot of tough units in the meta right now, Satan Shards, Monoliths, that just don't want to die to your regular Brightlance fire. So having a unit in your army that can, in a pinch, turn all of your shuriken weapons and all of your, scatter lasers and stuff like that into things that can generate some wounds against those tough targets, that's very effective, and it's very useful to have in your list. And it gives this unit a lot of synergy with other units in our army that are anti-MEQ or anti-infantry. As far as their cost, you would think that for all the stuff they have, they would be really expensive, but they're not. They only cost 80 points for 3 and 160 for 6. They're really cost effective for what you get. You typically probably want to run them in a unit of 3 because they're not a damage dealing unit. They're more of a utility unit. But I have seen them run in squads of 6 effectively as well. It just depends on, what your game plan is with them. As far as their keywords go, they have the mounted and fly keywords, making movement awkward through ruins and buildings. But, that's just like all jet bikes. They kind of have to roll with the punches on that one. The good news is these guys are fast, and they have a scout move to negate the negative penalties of that in the beginning of the game. All right, so what are their strengths and weaknesses? So they are very fast and have great flexibility in deployment with their scout move. They have decent anti-infantry firepower, enough firepower to typically kill a unit in the backfield, that's maybe a minimum squad of light infantry or something along those lines. So if your opponent doesn't protect their backlines with enough stuff, Shroud Runners can definitely outtrade those units in the backfield. They can easily score secondaries because they are very fast and they do have pistols. They also can give your army lethal hits against a target, so they're also a damage multiplier. And for being Eldar, they're actually pretty tough. Having toughness 4 is one thing, but they also come with a 5+ invulnerable save and stealth, as well as 3 wounds base. 3 wounds is a very awkward profile for a lot of anti-infantry or even anti-mech weapons to be able to deal with. So these guys can really take a greater beating than you would think in the early stages of the game when your opponent's main force isn't yet engaged. They do have their weaknesses, however. They are very weak in combat, obviously. They're the worst in the index, which is hilarious, but, still something you need to keep in mind. And their large bases can make movement awkward. But the benefit is you can also use their large bases to your own advantage with one of the better ways to use them in the game as well. As for their combos and synergies, lethal hits is extremely strong on both Shadow Specters and Wind Rider units, especially Shadow Specters with their blast, means you can take out whole Imperial Guard infantry units in one turn. It's really absolutely insane. A unit of Shadow Specters and a unit of these guys on average dice will probably kill a blob of 20 guardsmen. Unless, of course, you roll really bad, in which case only Isha can save you at that point. They can also benefit from Doom and Guide in equal measure, but they're probably, a little bit too expendable for that. You really don't want to be guiding these guys unless they're a unit of 6. And Doom is more of a, circumstantial buff. If they're shooting the same target that Doom also happens to be targeting, then, obviously it's fine. But you don't want to go out of your way to use it on them. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about making the most out of your scout move, because this is probably one of the biggest learning curves to actually playing these guys effectively in your games, is knowing how and when to use your scout move. So, we're going to be talking about 4 strategies that you can use in your games to get the most out of this movement. So the first one is what I like to call the bait and switch. The second is the rapid response. And then of course we have easy money and access denied. So for my examples, I'm going to be using terrain layout number 1. These examples actually work for every single terrain layout equally. You just need to be able to, know what the choke points are and things like that to be able to deploy your Shroud Runners effectively. But, essentially these strategies work for every single different type of terrain setup. All right, so the first one we're going to go over is bait and switch. And this one's pretty simple. You just deploy your Shroud Runners out in the open in a firing lane where your opponent can see them and potentially shoot them turn 1. Now, there is a strategy to this because oftentimes what your opponent will think you're trying to do is score on things like behind enemy lines or deploy teleport homers in their own deployment zone on turn 1, right? There's a lot of secondaries that your opponent can kind of basically deny you if they have a strong Overwatch unit, like, something with heavy flamers or something like that in their own deployment zone. Of course, the great thing about Shroud Runners on these terrain layouts, when you have a lot of different, ruins and line of sight blocking terrain on the battlefield, is that there are a lot of opportunities to ignore Overwatch and get around it, which I will talk about in one of my other examples. But essentially what we have here is your opponent's need or desire to deny your Shroud Runners the ability to just climb up the flank. And they're probably going to allocate some resources on that side of the battlefield to make sure that you don't get there safely. Or if you do get there, you're going to die immediately after. So what we do in this case is we use our scout move actually to just move over, right? So in this terrain layout, we have a ruin to our right of the Shroud Runners, which are on the bottom left in red. We have our opponent's units on the top left in blue. And we can do one or two things with this. We can either move back in deeper into our own deployment zone to try to reposition our Shroud Runners to the other side of the battlefield quickly, or we could just move behind that little piece of ruin right there in front of us, still be behind line of sight blocking terrain, but be in a position to score on objectives as they come to us. So we're essentially keeping our opponent's left flank in a constant state of, well, if I move forward, the Shroud Runners are just going to get around me and score on an objective. And I have a little bit of a secret for you guys. It's pretty much inevitable that if you keep your Shroud Runners in that position and just kind of chill with them, they're going to be able to make a huge impact on the objective game at some point, right? And this is where patience comes in, because sometimes a lot of players, what they'll want to do is try to shoot with their Shroud Runners immediately as soon as possible. That's not always the best play with them. They're not really a damage dealing unit. They're more of a control and utility style unit that wants to score on secondary objectives and things like that. So it might be worth it just to, again, bait your opponent into deploying some stuff on the other side of the battlefield and then just sitting there doing nothing. Until, of course, an opportunity arises. They're only 80 points. That means if your opponent is wasting 200 points worth of units trying to wait for the Shroud Runners so that they don't score an objective in their deployment zone, guess what? You're already winning the game. Alternatively, your opponent can just put something cheap over there, but in my experience, when an opponent does this, the cheap units that they put over there are actually sometimes the perfect targets for Shroud Runners. They're usually cheap light infantry units that Shroud Runners can actually defeat by themselves in some cases. And, if your opponent, again, does put a lot of models over there, you can always redirect your Shroud Runners elsewhere on the battlefield. The next example I have for you is rapid response. So what is rapid response? Well, your opponent deploys something via infiltrate or scout moves, something close to your army, right? Now, most of the time, this unit is going to be fairly fragile. So you can actually use your Shroud Runners scout move to respond rapidly to that situation. If you know who's going to go first, like let's say you go first, you get the first turn, you can move your Shroud Runners up 9 inches with the scout move. And then, of course, you can move them an additional 14 inches via their normal movement, and then you can fire upon that light target. Now, for this to work, it does need to be something that's fairly low armor, something like Mandrake, Striking Scorpions, Rangers, right? Something light infantry. But it does allow the Shroud Runners to take out a threat early on in the game that could cause you trouble later or could muck up your forces significantly. Mandrakes are a very sneaky unit. They can use Skyleap essentially, which is really good. They're back in the Shadows ability. They can also infiltrate. Taking out a unit of those early is actually pretty good. I know Mandrakes cost less than Shroud Runners, but, in the early stages of the game, if you get first turn, might be worth it to actually fire and fade Shroud Runners, maybe even try to score an objective with them, right, at the same time. That is, of course, if your opponent didn't screen it out beforehand. This also works great with tying up enemies in close combat. So again, Shroud Runners are not good in close combat, but if you know the enemy unit is also terrible in close combat and doesn't have the amount of attacks or weapon skill or whatever it is to deal with them effectively, then you can actually end up tying up an expensive unit in combat, right? And this is really good against things like vehicles. If your opponent has a vehicle that is, really high value, but obviously vehicles aren't great in combat. Of course, I'm not recommending you charge this into a dreadnought or anything like that, but, something like a Vindicator or something along those lines, that's a great trade. Yes, vehicles can fire out of combat, but you're limiting their movement. And if they move through you, they have to take a desperate escape, right? Unless they have the fly keyword, which, most ground vehicles just don't. So don't be afraid to also play your Shroud Runners very aggressively in the early game if you notice these opportunities presenting themselves. Okay, so this next diagram is easy money. So what is easy money? Well, basically easy money is scoring on the multitude of secondary objectives that you could possibly pull turn 1 and doing it very easily with Shroud Runners because of that scout move. So as you can see here, these are the number of ways in which you can move your Shroud Runners into the enemy deployment zone and still be fairly safe behind terrain. So even if you don't get first turn, in a lot of these deployments, you're also not going to be able to be shot at. So this allows you to kind of skirt the terrain, move 9 inches forward, and then use your 14-inch movement to move into the center-ish of the battlefield, more on your opponent's side, and then use fire and fade to get into the enemy deployment zone and score big on secondaries. Or just simply have something in your opponent's backfield, right? Like if they don't have any units to respond to your Shroud Runners and your Shroud Runners are behind obscuring terrain and they have nothing to get to you, either their units are going to have to move back to try to re-engage the Shroud Runners to get them out of their deployment zone, or they're going to have to sit a big expensive vehicle or something like that on their home objective so that their home objective doesn't get capped. And actually, funnily enough, sometimes that big expensive vehicle is still not enough because Shroud Runners have objective control too. And a lot of those big vehicles max out at OC4. So that means that unless they can kill a Shroud Runner in Overwatch and in combat, which if you charge, they're not going to be able to do, without the assistance of Tank Shock, of course, you can only Tank Shock if you charge, then you will be capturing that objective. And this has actually happened several times to me personally in games, where Shroud Runners, believe it or not, were able to capture enemy outposts just by simply being able to move close enough to the objective to get on it when an enemy vehicle was also on it. And of course, there are just so many other secondary objectives that these guys can score points on because they have that 9-inch scout move and can basically appear anywhere on the board that they want to, right? And of course, not only deploy teleport homers, but objectives like investigate signals or engage on all fronts. Or even, again, like I said before, behind enemy lines, right? There's a ton of secondary objectives that you can easily score with these guys from the beginning of the game. Okay, but what if you already have units that can score those secondary objectives and you're not really needing that at that particular moment? Or maybe you draw something that is very killy in the first couple of turns of the game and you realize that the bigger objective is to stop your opponent from being able to score their own secondaries and primary objectives. So this is where our last kind of tactic comes into play. And of course here I'm talking about access denied, which is the ability to move block your opponent's vehicles and infantry that don't have the fly keyword, of course, from moving up the board. Because Shroud Runners have those large bases, they can easily plug themselves into choke points like this, and your opponent's going to have a real hard time moving past them in the first turn of the game. If your opponent wants to get line of sight on a Warwalker or something that you have that's moving up the battlefield in a better position, guess what? They can't, because they have to kill your Shroud Runners first in order to move around that ruin. So immediately, your opponent's plans of being able to counter your enemy Warwalker or Wraithlord that's moving up the battlefield to the center with their, Predator Annihilator is all of a sudden up in smoke. Not only is your Wraithlord going to be safe from that enemy vehicle, but that enemy vehicle is pretty much going to be stuck in your opponent's deployment zone, right? They're either going to have to go all the way around, which is still going to be a waste of a turn, or they're going to just have to sit there and kill the Shroud Runners first. Which 9 times out of 10, unless your opponent's really unlucky, will happen, right? The Shroud Runners will die, but fortunately, you're blocking off a large part of their army from being able to get into a position, and now your Wraithlord is in the money, or your Warwalker, or whatever you're moving up the battlefield. And in this particular train setup, you would probably want to just move your Wraithlord right up behind the Shroud Runners, but to the right a little bit, right next to that middle ruin, so that your Wraithlord is still in a position that he can respond to either the middle objective or the left-hand side objective, but can also be spared from the enemy's hardest shooting capabilities. Because, Wraithlords are tough, but they're not tough enough to survive, 3 or 4, dedicated anti-large units firing at it. It will die. So being able to protect it for the first turn, sacrificing a unit of Shroud Runners so that your Wraithlord can go in there and wreck face is a pretty good tactic. Or, set up your Warwalker for a deadly Overwatch attack. Because Warwalkers are pretty fragile too, and they need to be protected, but sometimes you do need to get them to better vantage points in the battle, right? You can't just expect them to sit in your deployment zone the entire game. Sometimes you are going to have to just move them up the board to get those better positions. And of course, using Shroud Runners to set that up for you allows your Warwalkers, Wraithlords, and other units to be safe from the enemy's fiercest units. Well, at least for one more turn, right? Because Shroud Runners are going to die, but, it buys you a turn in the game. So what is the role that Shroud Runners play in an Eldar army, and how do you make the most out of them? So Shroud Runners, pure and simple, are a rapid deployment unit that are adept at providing screening, disruption, and of course, damage multiplication. They're also an extremely versatile unit that can provide a number of battlefield roles depending on your needs in any given turn. So in the first couple of turns in the game, if you draw that behind enemy lines or investigate signals, they can score it for you. If you don't draw that, then they're durable enough to, kind of survive any kind of light indirect fire. And even more heavy indirect fire, things like basilisks and stuff like that, can struggle to kill Shroud Runners because of their awkward 3 wound profile and because of the fact that they do have stealth, which helps negate that +1 ballistic skill that the guard tanks get from, their orders and stuff like that. And of course, this means that they can survive long enough to score on secondary objectives later in the game. And I actually love it when Imperial Guard players shoot at the Shroud Runners because it means all my other fragile aspect warriors are living to shoot and kill another day. But of course, if they don't shoot at the Shroud Runners are still very good into guard, both damage-wise and, objective-wise as well, because they can move super fast. And again, if those options aren't really available to you the first few turns of the game, you're not drawing the right secondaries and so forth, then you can definitely use these guys as a move blocker. This is especially important against armies like orcs, which like to just charge right at you, throw everything they got at you, and just overwhelm you, right? Orcs is a tricky matchup for Eldar to beat. And you do need to utilize some move blocking in order to defeat the Green Menace. So using your Shroud Runners to block up a couple of Orc trucks in the early game from being able to move through a choke point is a fantastic way to use them. And yes, they will die, but those Orc knobs that were going to, just wreck your Avatar of Cain the next turn aren't going to be able to. And yes, before you guys say anything, a fully kitted out unit of knobs under the effects of the Waaagh with the War Boss can easily destroy an Avatar on charge, right? No question. So in conclusion, Shroud Runners are an amazing unit that can be used in a variety of clever ways. They're great at objective play and have decent damage to boot. Plus, they're one of the coolest looking models in the index. I mean, they look really cool, right? They're plastic, they're a great unit, not only in aesthetics, but also in gameplay. And they're also pretty easy to get your hands on. I know a lot of third-party retailers sell them for much cheaper than GW does, so you can get your hands on them for a decent price. So yeah, that's Shroud Runners for you. Really clever unit that can score you objective points in a number of different ways. If you have an extra 80 points in your list, Shroud Runners are rarely a bad option to throw in. And because they're such a versatile unit, you're going to find yourself getting better with them the more games you play with them, because there's just so many different ways to use them, and they just have so many different applications. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching, and thank you so much once again to all my Patreons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last year. Your help has greatly improved the channel and helped it grow significantly. If you do want to help support the channel, I have free trials activated on my Patreon, which will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who love talking about strategies, tactics, and of course, hobbying. I will leave the link for that in the description below. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you want to grab some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon or grab some Eldar-inspired apparel on the channel store page to rep your local game store, I will leave those links in the description as well. Lastly, I do have an Eldar community painting project video coming up at the end of the month. If you do want to make a submission to that, please email me at the channel email. You will also find that in the description. And it can basically be whatever work you're proud of personally. It doesn't matter if it's pro painted or not, just something you're proud of. Make sure the quality of the picture itself is good though, no blurry pictures, things like that. But as long as it's a good quality picture, I'd be more than happy to have it in the community video. So go ahead and send it in and just attach along with it your nickname or whatever you want to use to claim credit for it. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching once again, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.